All right, good morning. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday morning, on a hot summer day. So my name is Claudia Monterrosa, and I'm the Director for Public Policy and Research at the Housing and Community Investment Department. And you are here today to officially help us kick off the Round 5 Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program for the City of Los Angeles. And we have a full agenda. Hopefully you have one of those in front of you. And we will first hear from the Strategic Growth Council who are here today. We're very happy to welcome them. And then you'll hear about the process, and we'll give you a little bit of an overview of our work on this program over the last 4 years and how we are preparing for Round 5. And you will hear specifically from each of our team members that make up the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program team at the City of LA. And then with us, we have Enterprise Community Partners, who is a partner with us and that provides technical assistance and has been a partner since the beginning of this program. And then we'll have a few minutes for question and answer for anybody that's interested in asking any of us any questions about how to work with the city as a co-applicant. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Carol Abbott from the Strategic Growth Council.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to see this turnout and be able to talk about the program, which has a lot of money this year, I should say up front. So I'm going to go through this quickly just to make sure we stay on schedule. But I think the slides are going to be distributed later. So if I just go really quickly past something, you can reference it later, and then we'll have time for questions. All right. Not advancing. There it was here. Okay. So I'm going to go quickly over the overview and goals of the program. So just to kind of frame this a little bit, why AHSC is one of the climate investment programs, kind of why this program exists, is to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So this I know is difficult to see, but it shows the emission sources in the state of California. That column on the far left in blue is the transportation sector, and that first big piece of it is passenger vehicles. So that's just from folks driving individually in cars. Which begs the question, why do we drive so much? And it's really looking at a lack of location-efficient housing and quality low-carbon transportation options. So housing isn't located near the places where people need to be every day, and there are also not as many options as there could be for alternative transportation so that people could choose not to drive. So that's where AHSC comes in. We fund infill projects that reduce GHGs through reducing vehicle miles traveled, through sustainable land use, housing, and transportation practices by bringing together the worlds of both affordable housing and transportation. In addition to reducing GHG emissions, we have a couple other statutory requirements. The second is to direct investment towards the most disadvantaged communities in the state and also to maximize economic, environmental, and public health benefits to the state. So just keep that in mind as I kind of am going through the different required elements of the program. Just to quickly go over the disadvantaged communities component. So as one of the climate investment programs, we're required to invest in disadvantaged communities. AHSC in particular has to invest 50% of our funds in disadvantaged communities. If you have a project that's not located in a disadvantaged community, you're still eligible completely. That's just a requirement that's set in statute for us. And we also have to fund in low-income communities, I should mention. So this is a map of the CalEnviroScreen tool overlaid with the AB 1550 tool. This is looking at both disadvantaged and low-income communities within Los Angeles. So Los Angeles has a high number of disadvantaged and low-income community census tracts. And so you can reference this tool when looking at your project to see whether you fall into that classification. So getting into the nuts and bolts of what the program actually funds, we have a list of capital projects as well as some program costs. So the first and probably the main component is the affordable housing development. This is a loan, and it is for the construction of the housing itself. Then we have housing-related infrastructure. This comes in the form of a reimbursable grant. It's anything that's required as a condition of approval for the housing development itself. So that can be sewer, water, electric, but also if there's a requirement that roads have to be built out, say the city imposes that upon the developer, this part of the grant will pay for that infrastructure. And then we have sustainable transportation infrastructure, also coming in the form of a reimbursable grant. This is anything that's capital infrastructure that enables or encourages mode shift. So that's like a physical transit vehicle, a bus, bike lanes, sidewalks, that kind of thing. And then we have transportation-related amenities. Again, reimbursable grant. This is anything that makes it easier, safer, more comfortable for folks to use those transit options. So you can get a little creative in this category. It's got a pretty long list of eligible costs. Things like bike parking, bike repair kiosks, street trees, bus shelters, things of that nature. And then we have a few eligible program costs, and I think I accidentally left a couple off this slide, but the first of those is active transportation programs. So those are things that incentivize or enable people to better use active transportation. One example we've had of this is like a walking school bus. And then we have transit ridership programs, again, anything that incentivizes or enables folks to use public transportation. We often see in this category transit passes being provided to residents of the broader project area. And then our other program costs that are eligible are criteria air pollutant programs. So that's educational programs on how to reduce exposure to criteria air pollutants. And then workforce development programs is the fourth category that's now eligible under programs. So because California is such a diverse state, we break the state up into 3 project area types. The first of these is transit-oriented development. To be in the TOD category, you are defined by having high-quality transit. So that means that your planned housing development is within a half mile of a transit stop that has both fixed infrastructure and headways of 15 minutes or less. So we define fixed infrastructure as like a dedicated infrastructure for like light rail, for example, or a bus-only lane. This project area type requires affordable housing and at least one other project component. I should note now, though, that for reasons of competitiveness, you're really going to need to have both affordable housing and transportation as a part of your project in order to be successful in the program. So the required minimum density for this category is 30 units to the acre, though, again, for reasons of competitiveness, we've seen averages that are much higher, looking 100, 150 units to the acre for this category. Not a requirement, but a good benchmark. We can get into that when we go into the greenhouse gas scoring. And then we have the integrated connectivity project area type. This is where the housing development is within a half mile of a qualifying transit stop. This is pretty much transit that doesn't meet the definition of high quality transit, but still exists. There are some specifications around the headways, but you can build it in as part of your project if at the time of application it doesn't meet that requirement. This tends to be the more suburban areas, a little lower density. Required minimum density of 20 units to the acre for these projects. We see an average of about 50 for this category. And then 35% of awards are set aside for ICP and TOD, if I didn't say that earlier. That's that last row down there. And then we have our rural innovation project areas. The RIPA category uses the same definition for rural as TCAC, just for alignment there. So that category, again, requires sustainable transportation infrastructure, Qualifying transit, we see a lot of flexible transit as a part of our rural applications. Required minimum density of 15 units to the acre, we see pretty close to that, maybe like 15 to 20%, 15 to 20 units to the acre. And then 10% of awards are set aside for that category. You'll notice that only adds up to 80%. We have 20% discretionary funding that's set aside for the Strategic Growth Council members themselves to make discretionary awards to meet statutory requirements, programmatic priorities, or any kind of priority issues that have come up in that funding round. An example of that is there was a priority to fund projects in areas that were affected by recent wildfires. So just for a really quick visual of what this can look like, we have affordable housing that's connected by bike lanes to a school down in the bottom left corner, some pedestrian pathways connecting over to the grocery store, expanded bus routes, bus shelters, sidewalks, and urban greening, just to really emphasize the point that this program is designed to be a community development program and not just focused on one particular component like the housing or the transportation piece of things. Which kind of gets into the partnership model. So in order to really orchestrate these projects, you need a large group of partners. You need to be able to work with the jurisdiction as a developer. So it's actually really great to be here at this event because we really rarely see jurisdictions that are actively soliciting applications, offering to help and work with applicants, developer partners on creating these applications and dedicating staff time and resources to working on their pieces of these applications. So we generally tend to see a developer or a housing authority working with local government, Department of Public Works, who you'll hear from earlier, tends to be involved, and then ideally transit agencies as well where that's possible. So we have currently a minimum funding award of $1 million, a max award of $20 million. We are currently going through guidelines revisions to update these numbers in particular to try to be consistent with HCD's MHP program and their maximum award, and particularly their maximum loan amount for the housing component. We are funded until 2030 through cap and trade, and we are what's called continuously appropriated, so we don't have to go to the legislature to determine our dollar amount for each year. We get 20% of the cap and trade auction proceeds. Basically, that just means that we have a somewhat stable source of funding, although it's dependent on what the auction proceeds are from year to year. This last year, we received the largest amount of money that we have so far. The numbers are still being exactly figured out based on the most recent auction, but it's looking like we'll have at least $550 million, which is really substantial, and it's just for 1 year. So this is a great opportunity to just, give it a shot if you've got a project that you think might work out. I wanted to give a couple examples of projects that were funded this last round. The city did very well. I believe 5 out of 5 projects were funded, which is really impressive. I think the overall success rate was around 60%. So the city's work and the work of enterprise on getting these applications put together with the developers really showed. This is the Vermont Manchester Transit Priority Project, which was actually a collaboration with the County of LA, provided some affordable housing, but also really critical bikeway and walkway improvements throughout the project area with a key connection linking to a school, and received the full amount of $20 million. And then we had the Manchester Urban Homes Project, which was a reapplication that was in the TOD category, provided 119 units of housing, and then included some community serving, retail or office space on the ground floor, had bike share for residents along with bike safety repair workshops and community bike rides to really integrate the active transportation into the project, created green alleyways throughout the project area, and had a collaboration with the group Tree People to work on their urban greening component. and again, receive the full award amount of $20 million. So, to get quickly into the program requirements and scoring. Our threshold requirements kind of break into two categories. The first of those is our readiness requirements. So again, as one of the climate investment programs, there's a real push to get these projects on the ground as fast as possible so we can start reducing our carbon footprint as a state as soon as possible, which is why we have such high readiness criteria. So that's looking at things like making sure there's environmental clearance for the housing component, having site control at the time of application, any discretionary land use approvals are in hand, and then a committed funding threshold is a pretty key piece of making sure that 90% of the overall project cost is had at the time of application, including whatever you're asking for from AHSC. So you have 45% of the total development costs you're asking for from AHSC, and then 45% from other sources. You would make it to that 90% threshold. And then we have a number of programmatic thresholds. This is kind of going back to that statutory requirement to have maximize economic, environmental, public health benefits. So this is looking at things like making sure you're preserving agricultural land, not building on agricultural land, including urban greening components, providing transit passes for residents. That's one discounted pass for every affordable unit in your development is that requirement. And a few others, making sure that there's a certain level of affordability, which all of can be found in our program guidelines if you want to really dig into those. We also have a really long list of scoring criteria, which looks very daunting at first, but there's a very experienced team here that can help walk you through what's needed for those different components. And it's broken into three categories. So the biggest piece of those points comes from the quantitative policy scoring criteria. This is 55 points of the total 100 points. And these are really the easy to score quantifiable items that you can take a checklist approach to. So the other pieces are a little harder to be able to predict your score on, but this you can go down and see how many points you're going to get, and you really want to approach it from the standpoint of getting as many points as you can. That being said, this is not like other programs where you can get all of the points and then there's a tiebreaker. We've never had anybody receive all of the points in this category. Then there's this big piece, which is the greenhouse gas quantification methodology scoring, which is 30 points. We have two categories here. There's both cost efficiency and total reduction. So cost efficiency is looking at the amount of GHGs you're reducing for every dollar of AHSC funding you're receiving. And then total reduction is just the raw number that you're reducing. And this really takes into account a few components. The biggest factor that we see here is having a strong transit component in the last couple rounds that's really come to the forefront as driving the GHG scores. The housing is also really taken into account, though not as strong as the transit component, it's still very important. And then of course the amount of funding you're asking for has to be balanced with that efficiency score. They are scored separately by project area type, so the TOD projects are not going to be scored against the ICP projects, which are not going to be scored against the rural projects. This is just showing the average reductions for each of those categories. Obviously, if we scored the rural areas against the very urban areas, that would create some strong inequities in this scoring. So like I said earlier, we take into account housing, transportation. We also added solar in the last round, so if you have solar production as a part of your project, definitely can include that. There are several things that the tool currently doesn't take into account, which are important to note. So if you're replacing a transit vehicle with, say, a zero-emission bus, that isn't calculated by the tool. Repaired or replaced sidewalks aren't taken into account by the tool. Neither are upgraded bike lanes, the energy efficiency of the building, and urban greening. So I should note that both AHSC on our end and on the California Air Resources Board, that side of things, we are both updating the guidelines and the quantification methodology over the summer. So it's possible that these things will change, and during the comment period for the quantification methodology, you can submit public comment if you would like, for example, one of these things that aren't currently calculated to be taken into account. I'm going to move really quickly through these little tips that I put together for the narrative-based policy scoring, but again, they're in the presentation if you want to take a look at them. So our narrative-based policy is the section where you have the chance to describe and explain parts of the project that are a little less possible to take a checklist approach to. So we have collaboration and planning that's really looking at the partnership that went into putting together a project and how the different components are integrated. Community benefit engagement, how community residents were engaged in the design of the project and how their feedback was incorporated into that final design. Community climate resiliency is really looking at the ways the project is taking into account climate adaptation. So if there are any vulnerabilities or risks, how the project is addressing that. And then community air pollution exposure mitigation. Similarly, if there are pollutant sources near any part of the project that residents would be exposed to, what you're doing as a part of the project to mitigate that impact to project area residents. There are a number of planning and educational resources embedded within the guidelines themselves. There's a narrative rubric on the SGC website that you can look at and kind of design your responses to. We really encourage you to do that, actually. And there are past project scores on the SGC website as well. And we have the FAST application portal, which we have instructions for how to use on our website as well, where you can go and look at every past application from the program to see what their narrative was, how they scored, maybe how they did that well. So I'm just going to kind of skip by these slides, but when you go back and take a look at them later, these are just things that we've noticed over the last couple rounds of using this specific narrative and tips that we have on how to address answering these questions and things we want to make sure that people are including. So moving to the end here so we can keep on time. Just to make sure that everybody knows, our draft program guidelines for round 5 are going to be coming out probably towards the end of this month. We went through a public comment period earlier. I know that keeps getting pushed back a little bit, but we're trying really hard to make sure that actually happens. And we'll be going through another comment period as well as holding draft guidelines workshops to get feedback on the draft and see whether there are additional changes that should be made or changes that we should back away from. And then we'll be releasing the round 5 final guidelines and application. We actually have a date set for guidelines adoption of October 31st. We're having a Halloween council meeting. So if you want to come dressed up, please do. And then applications will be due in February of 2020 with awards being made in June of 2020. And we are keeping to an annual cycle, or trying to keep to an annual cycle since we're annually funded. So you can expect us to keep to roughly this schedule going forward as well if you have a round 6 project, for example. And just another note that we have a host of resources on our website that you can really dive into. We're going through an ADA update, so some of these documents unfortunately aren't there right now, but we're working to get that all up to date so that all of this valuable information will be up there. So that you can take a look at what folks have done in the past and frequently asked questions on how to interpret guidelines, for example. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Here's my personal email at SGC as well as our program email for broader questions as well. All right, so Claudia is going to come back up.
Thank you, Coral, and thank you for taking such an early flight to be here with us. I would like to talk about how we're going to engage for the round 5 process. So we've been at it on this project since round 1, and every year is a different experience, but it's one experience that we continue to build on, and it's been great. And one thing that I really want to shout out to is the team that we have been working with at the city. It's a core team of various city agencies that have come together to be able to provide the type of focus and determine services with our co-applicants. So the way that this program works, as Coral just explained, is that you will definitely need a local agency to be your partner. And in this situation, the city does have a set criteria that establishes every year through the council process. And since round 3, the city of LA has elected to be responsible for the STI, or the Sustainable Transit Infrastructure component, and the transportation related amenities component. So the grant portions of the grant application, the city will be responsible for. And the developer then will be responsible for the affordable housing development and the program related costs and any housing related infrastructure components. And so the way that this works is that this is a collaborative team approach. It just does not work if everybody is not in. And so this is just a capturing of how this works. Just to dig in a little bit more into the project area type, we are very diligent about mapping and identifying projects that fall under TOD, ICP, and ICP. And we actually have created a website that you will find on our webpage at HCIDLA.org. And you can also find, type in an address and see if it's in a disadvantaged community or not. The city of LA happens to make up about 68% of the total disadvantaged communities in the county of LA. So we do have a lot of opportunities to cite programs in there. So it's a good thing, but not a bad thing at the same time, because we have a lot of impacted areas. And we also do happen to have a lot of low-income census tracts. So I think for the most part, we are covered. However, we are seeking to be more equitably distributed. So we are looking to hopefully find projects that are located in high resource areas as well to help address our fair housing issues. Here is an image of how we work, high level. Alina will be going into a little bit more detail about this, but today marks the call for projects process. This is us asking for any interest in working with the city. Just to let you know, we have started already a preliminary review of potential projects based on our pipeline. And those projects will be prioritized. However, it doesn't mean that if you're not in any of our pipelines that we will not consider being a co-applicant. In round 4, we actually did have one of our winning projects that were not part of our managed pipeline. We will do an extensive review and selection process. We will conduct developer clinics, develop the STI and TRA scope, and you'll hear a little bit more in-depth discussion about this from our Department of Planning and Department of Transportation. We will develop the cost estimates for both the STI, TRA. We will gather the information, but work very closely with the developer. The developer ultimately is responsible for submitting the application. And all the components. And then we will definitely execute the final documents and do a final review. So the city has to approve all of the materials that are put it into the application to ensure accuracy. And also this is a co-application. We're all responsible, mutually responsible for the success of the program, for the application and for the implementation components. So very quickly, I want to go over what we did for round 4. We submitted 5 applications for a total of 709 units, and we requested $84.9 million, both on the housing loan component and grants. And we also proposed together 2.84 miles of sidewalk improvements, almost 9 miles of bike facilities. And I'm happy to say that we were able to increase our GHG output for these 5 applications, over 115,000 metric tons of reduction. And this is our funding for breakdown. The majority of it, about $58 million, is going towards housing development component, and about $25 million for the grant that makes up the STI and TRA. Here's an example of a winning applicant, the Weingart Tower and Skid Row project. This is a fantastic project in collaboration, and we're happy to be part of this. This actually has substantial monies from the HHH funding measure, and we're happy to say that we got the total amount requested, which is $20 million. And this has other funding sources as well. It has HHH, Affordable Housing Pipeline, county, and it also has a land component that is owned by the city. I wanted to also say here's the final score results for round 5. I mean, we were just ecstatic, beyond ecstatic, that we were so successful, and we would strive to meet that again for round 5, but the field is increasing in terms of the competition. So there are a lot of competing resources out there as well coming from the state, but we will try to, we will make every effort to be able to work with you to take you to the finish line. So here's just an example of how we did and how we fared in our total scores. And I think that in terms of the total number of projects that were awarded, we were pretty good in terms of our scoring numbers. And here are the competition results. So we asked for 84.9, we received $84.9 million. And that brings the total impact and request amount and awarded to the City of LA in the last 4 rounds to nearly $200 million, helping fund 2,200 affordable housing units in 21 projects. So now I'd like to bring, you will hear from each of our team members, and I'd like to really spend a little bit of time on that so that you can really understand how is it that we work collaboratively with you. And I would be remiss to say that it's not only the developer, the city team, enterprise, but also the council offices where your projects are located. And so we definitely partner with them from the onset. If you've already had any initial conversations with your council member, that would be great. If you're thinking about, you might be competitive for this round, start having those conversations, but we will initiate those conversations as well. But any kind of forefront discussions with your council member will be great. In particular for the STI and TRA components, just to start talking about it. Some council offices are much more supportive of the STI TRA than others, or helping really explain that process, because it will have an impact directly into the streets of that particular council office. And I want to here showcase all of the different team members and the effort, and basically all the different agencies that are represented here. And we'll start with the planning department with Rubina Gazarian.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rubina Gazarian with the Department of City Planning, Mobility Policy Unit for citywide geography. We are a proud partner of the HCIDLA process and have been throughout the 5 rounds, the 4 previous rounds and the current one. We believe strongly in the HCIDLA process of connecting the dots between land use and transportation. This is a really critical planning process, because that's the way that we're going to be successful in terms of rebalancing the jobs and housing imbalance that many of our cities, including Los Angeles, have today. This is also in line with our policy goals of the Mobility Plan 2035 and LA's Green New Deal. Starting with the Mobility Plan 2035, that's our city's transportation general plan element, which talks about, it has many policies and goals about connecting the dots between land use and transportation. These are some of the important components that are going to allow us to have safer places for people to bike and walk, to enhance public transportation services, to improve the roadway network, and build a multimodal approach to transportation. And the housing and transportation investment is really, that coupling of that is how we are going to be successful as a city. So I want to just make sure that you have the resources as you're planning your future, as you're looking at this as a potential funding source over the next 10 years or more. We really encourage you to be looking at the mobility plan network, specifically where we have classified pedestrian enhanced districts and bicycle enhanced networks and transit enhanced networks. These are located on pages 136 to 149 of the mobility plan. You can also just Google mobility plan networks. And we encourage you to take a look at the city's planning of those networks and then work with us early in order to have solid footing when it comes to planning your project over the next many years. And in accordance with LA's Green New Deal, which was released earlier this year by the mayor's office, we have some excellent goals in terms of where we want units to be located within 1,500 feet of transit, 75% of our units by 2035. So this really speaks to where our city is headed, where our state is headed. And we're proud to be part of this process. And we really think this is going to boost our sustainability goals and help us to achieve those targets. If you have any questions regarding this process, I'm happy to help answer those questions. And now I want to call up my colleague in city planning, Eric Claros, to tell us more about the housing side of the process.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Eric GLaDOS. I'm one of the planners in the Department of City Planning's Housing Services Unit, which basically just means the Affordable Housing Unit. Wanted to talk about some of the entitlement paths for some of these projects. I think that everyone's basically pretty familiar with like density bonus, our transit-oriented communities program. Those are always good options for approving affordable housing projects. We do have the Qualified Permanent Supportive Housing Ordinance. That one's currently under litigation, so we haven't had many takers for it, but you can still actually go through the process. And then any project that has at least 20% of the total units set aside for as affordable units goes under the Mayor's Priority Housing Program, which is a form of streamlining to get these approvals faster. Like typically, a director's level case will be approved within 6 to 9 months. Under the PHP program, it's probably going to be closer to 3 to 4. But I also wanted to talk about two new options that have come up recently. The two streamlining bills, SB 35 and AB 2162. So with SB 35, there's some great benefits to requesting an SB 35 streamlining process. One is that we would have to approve the project within either 90 days or 180 days, depending on the size of the project. If your project is 150 units or less, we have to approve it within 90 days. If it's more than that, then we have up to 180 days to complete our review and public oversight process, which includes any potential appeals. So in theory, like let's say that we approve a project in day 90, there really is nothing we can do with an appeal at that point. It's done, it's approved. There is no parking required for any units whatsoever in the project, so long as you're within a 1/2 mile of what's called a public transit stop. It's an easier criteria to meet than the major transit stop under transit-oriented communities. Right now, the major transit stop is just if you're within a 1/2 mile of like 2 buses that intersect, each with a service interval of 15 minutes or less. This definition actually allows us to combine buses heading in the same direction. So it shouldn't be too much of an issue for areas to qualify. Probably the biggest benefit is no CEQA review required whatsoever. Even if the project would normally require an entitlement such as site plan review, density bonus on menu, off menu, whatever the case may be, no CEQA review whatsoever. The project becomes ministerial if you meet the criteria. There is no expiration for the approval if you're getting funding beyond tax credits. The city can only enforce objective zoning criteria such as like heights, FAR, things like that. Any subjective criteria in an entitlement, such as neighborhood character, appropriateness, basically just goes out the window. We would not enforce that at all. And we can pair it up with certain entitlements, like density bonus, TOC. We can't pair it up with anything that is right from the get-go trying to not meet objective zoning criteria, such as variances or zone changes. So the barrier of entry is somewhat high, but I would think that most of the projects that you would be proposing meet this criteria. Not to scare you, I'll just list a few of them. It has to be half the units have to be affordable. The project cannot be located in an environmentally sensitive area, such as like a coastal zone or a hazardous waste site. So fairly intuitive in that sense. There has to be prevailing wages and skilled labor, which I suspect will not be a major issue for projects getting funding. The biggest one is probably the fact that you cannot develop on a site where anyone has lived in the past 10 years. So single family homes, a duplex, you can't really redevelop in that way. So this is probably better for sites that are either vacant, parking lots, or were used for commercial purposes. And this has been in effect since 2018. So we've had 2 projects approved under SB 35 streamlining. We have about 3 or 4 more in our pipeline as well. The second one is AB 2162 streamlining for permanent supportive housing projects. Similar to SB 35, it's a streamlining process that you request. We have to approve projects within either 90 days or 150 days, depending on the size of the project. 50 units or less, we have to approve within 90 days. More than 50 units, we have to approve it within 150 days. There's no parking required for the supportive housing units if you're within 1/2 mile of transit, which in this program just means any bus stop. No CEQA required whatsoever because the project becomes by right. The city would only enforce objective zoning standards as well. And we know right now that you can combine it with like a density bonus, either on or off menu request and site plan review. We're still trying to figure out if we can combine it with other programs, specifically TOC. We have more information on SB 35 online on the form section of our website. For AB 2162, that's pending, but it will be very similar. For AB 2162, the project has to be 100% affordable, and 1/4 of the units have to be for supportive housing. So the barrier of entry isn't as high. Other than that, all the units have to have a bathroom and kitchen, so that should be pretty easy to meet. And then you just have to provide the city or the planning department a supportive services plan. So that just really entails naming the organization that's going to provide the supportive services, the funding source for the supportive services, and the staffing level. So it's not very complicated in that sense. So I'm going to stick around, obviously, to if you have any additional questions regarding these streamlining processes. They're still very new. In regards to AB 2162, we have 1 project that has been approved that requested this process, and 2 more in our pipeline. So just trying to get the word out regarding this. Thank you.
All right, so I will be speaking a little bit about the other role the housing department plays in the team, which is our housing development component. So we work very closely with our Housing Development Bureau, with Yaneli Ruiz and Mariano Napa, who's here, and of course with our Assistant General Manager, Sean Spear. And actually, there are some key components in there. We do the financial review, cursory, basically ensuring that the project is financially sound and that it will meet the minimum threshold criteria. Looking at the enforceable funding commitments, because that's pretty significant. That is a threshold item. And we are going to also be verifying the sources for the leveraging. We currently have 3 different pipelines. I think I only listed 2 here, but we have Prop HHH, the Affordable Housing Managed Pipeline, and we also have our Land Development Pipeline. You may have applied for a new generation fund, and you may be thinking about, applying for the pipeline. Now that we know that this program is going to be around for a few, for at least a decade. If you're starting to think about a potential co-application, we'd be happy to talk to you for round 6 or for round 7. But for round 5, you pretty much have to know that you'll be able to meet the threshold criteria, including having the entitlement or the planning completed before the application deadline, which is February. So we will be also looking at that. We also issue the letters for Article 34, and we do the NEPA review if funded by home, project-based vouchers, or other federal funds that trigger that NEPA requirement. And I also want to give a shout out to the Strategic Growth Council that worked with us very significantly in allowing additional time for the NEPA review given the government shutdown during the application process. So just really want to highlight that this team and Strategic, the SGC really work collaboratively. And so this is like a really well-rounded, holistic approach to this program. So now I'd like to introduce our Department of Transportation folks, and we will start with Rose.
Hi, I'm Rose McCarran. I'm with the Planning and Policy Division at LADOT, and just going to speak to a little bit about the work we're doing and how it works with this program. So when you're thinking about what the STI TRA is going to be, we have a well-defined policy framework here for the City of LA. LADOT's top priority is making our streets safer. Vision Zero is our initiative to eliminate traffic fatalities in the city of Los Angeles. So any of the STI TRA, we want to keep safety in mind. Some proven safety measures that can, improve safety on our streets are reorganizing the streets to provide some more space for bicyclists, pedestrians, and transit, just more pedestrian spaces, left turns for cars so that they can turn more safely. Rubina went through the mobility plan. That's our vision of how our streets are going to function, and that's something important to keep in mind as you plan these improvements. The city, LADOT, has our strategic plan, which emphasizes that we want to have safe, accessible, inclusive, and sustainable investments. And we also have a new transit plan that is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by electrifying our vehicle fleet and improving headways and adding service. So as part of the mobility investment plan, we have identified we have an inventory of all of the projects that are currently going on, as well as our concepts, things that we have identified community needs and we know we need to address. And so we will leverage this program and identify investments that fit in with the AHSC model, and we can identify concepts that may pair well with your project, and we can also identify projects that are already funded that may contribute to an enforceable funding commitment that you can leverage for your application. And I'm going to turn it over to Claire, who's going to provide some more details.
Hi, good morning. I'm Claire Eberle. I'm with the Active Transportation Division at DOT in the Capital Projects Bureau. So as Rose mentioned, we are able to use the Mobility Investment Program, and just a little peek behind the curtain as to how that process can play out as it relates to the HCIDLA program. Here is an example project from last year that was also shown earlier as a successfully funded project. And we are able to use the MIP project database tool as project scoping kicks off to look at what planning and project development has taken place previously in the vicinity of a project site. And this enables us to map potential projects, including funded city projects with enforceable funding commitments that could be leveraged, as well as unfunded projects that might be compatible and competitive for HCIDLA funds. And last year, the result with the Weingart project was a successful award, including 30% or a total of $6 million for transportation improvements that included protected bike lanes in the neighborhood, pedestrian crossing signals, street lighting, street trees, and very importantly, pedestrian improvements, crosswalks, curb ramps, sidewalk repairs, and a couple key crossings to close pedestrian gaps. So I think Coral touched on this. We are aiming to incorporate as many sort of improvements as we can. Successful projects must incorporate elements that create safe and accessible walkways, establish or upgrade bicycle facilities, and generally improve conditions for active transportation and transit access around a project site. Of course, going back to that goal of encouraging biking and walking and sustainable transportation modes, including riding transit. So this will look very different for every project based on community needs and priorities. But the most competitive projects will include most of these improvements, potentially others. Coral gave some really creative examples earlier, and we continue to kind of consider everything. The challenge here is often making these really cohesive and part of a well-connected plan, putting all the pieces together in a way that meets the budget and also meets the scoring criteria competitively. Transit capital improvements and bike share opportunities are something that we want to consider. They may not be appropriate for every site, but we have had last year and in previous years some competitive applications, including those. So we bring together teams across the city, across DOT in particular, to make sure we're maximizing the funding opportunity. And DOT Transit was an important collaborator last year. As Rose showed earlier, there is a new transit plan for DOT that was the result of a recently completed transit service analysis that includes electrifying the full fleet and service expansions. So if a project is in close proximity to a new route or an expanding route, there may be opportunities to contribute to electric bus purchase. So the process is really important to us. An efficient partnership is really key for all the city agencies that are going to be working with you. I think the three sort of key steps in that process are to make sure that we define and commit to our respective roles and responsibilities early in the process, and make sure that we have deadlines laid out, which HCID is, really great at leading that charge, but it is a collaborative thing. And to make sure we're collaborating efficiently, we do have to kind of maximize city resources and make sure that we're communicating with each other as you go out and do your own independent engagement and outreach to community members and council offices and things like that. We like to close the loop, make sure that we're talking to each other, and ultimately, optimizing the funding impact. We want to plan for project readiness. And that is, I think, a shared goal across everyone. Just want to make sure that we can deliver the project that we're scoping with you, so that we get it in the ground, and we know that deadlines and delivery is really important to realizing your projects. It's important to us as well. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleagues at the Bureau of Engineering.
Hi there, I'm Steve Chen with the Bureau of Engineering, the division manager with the Street and Stormwater Program. So I think all the previous departments kind of summarized a lot of the information quite well, planning, DOT, and housing. So I'll just try to add a little bit to what we do here with Bureau of Engineering. So the Street and Stormwater Division is part of the overall group called the Mobility and Engineering Services. So in addition to street design and construction, we also have other support groups such as our environmental, real estate, and structural engineering support groups, and they could get involved, but probably to a lesser degree in these types of projects. But just to let you know that we have those resources. I don't have any. I don't have any photos of the. They just go off. Oh, sorry. It's working now. All right. Yeah. So sorry. So unfortunately, I don't have any photos of actual AHSC projects that have been completed because we just started recently with round 3, and so there haven't been any construction that have been completed. But I provided some photos here that just show some of the projects that we've done recently. We have Century Boulevard here on the top, which is a brand new street. We have one here down on the left side is Alhambra Avenue, which we added a left turn lane. And then on the bottom right is Descanso Avenue, which is a street which we reconstructed completely from the ground up. So anyway, that's just some ideas. And as it was mentioned previously that there's a total of, I think, 2.8 miles of sidewalks, 8.9 miles of bike facilities. So that's a lot of infrastructure that we'll have to build and assess. And as part of that, what we do is once we, as part of scoping and determining the scope of the project, and we go out to the site, visit the site, and look at the existing conditions, determine things that need to be upgraded or improved. One of the big things right now is ADA compliance. That's a really big issue for us, and it creates a lot of challenges lots of times, but it also is a requirement that we must follow. So that is a big part of how we scope our projects. We all obviously work closely, as I mentioned before, we work closely with the other city offices and the council office to determine what is the focus areas that they would like to see in these STI projects. And again, I think it was mentioned earlier, some of the elements that we're talking about are curb ramps, bus pads. The focus is to make it safe for pedestrians and bicyclists to get to and from the stations. And some of that also requires us to look at how these new facilities will impact the drainage. So there's a lot of engineering that goes in, as part of that design. But the focus here again is safety. And so what we do once we get the scope, so part of this process is becoming more detailed as to what the actual scope of work will be, because in the end we have to give this to a contractor to do the work, and so it has to be pretty detailed. And so we prepare an estimate which includes all the quantities and units of each of the elements of the work, including the removals and the reconstruction, and we add a little bit of contingency there just in case of unknown issues that come up. And sometimes it may be a little bit iterative process because defining what the priorities are versus the budget we have to come to that eventually and then come up with the final scope of work. And then once we do that, then we go to a complete design process where we will design the project, and then once the design completed, we go through a competitive bid and award process to different contractors, and then award the contract. Once a contract is awarded, then we work with the our other sister bureau, which is contract administration and inspection and managing the construction of the project. So that's the complete process. And of course, we're also working alongside the developer the whole time and with other sister agencies. And these are just some photos that I showed of earlier of some projects we've done. But yeah, again, here's Century Boulevard, a brand new street in Watts community. And then the one here on the right is Descanso Drive, a brand new street in Silver Lake. So that's pretty much it. Next, I think we have street lighting. Sure. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Shanta Wasapi. I'm with the Bureau of Street Lighting Infrastructure and Specifications Division. So to further enhance the safety of pedestrian and traffic from the proposed project locations to the closest bus stops or train station, we are proposing upgrading the existing light and installation of pedestrian lights. For street lighting installations and upgrades, proposed project will include but not limited to LED conversions on all impacted blocks, high voltage conversions on all impacted blocks as well. And we'll do bus stop lighting installed. And this slide is showing some of the options for bus stop lighting electrolytes. There are more possibilities, and new types can always be added. However, they need to be approved by our bureau before they can be installed. For bus stop lighting, there is no Prop 218 assessment because they are considered general benefit. However, if it is on a sidewalk where there are properties and it's just for pedestrians to walk, then the benefiting properties will be assessed. Then we will have, the next one is for electric vehicle charging stations. And for these, the Bureau of Street Lighting is already installing EV charging stations at various locations within the city. Last year, we installed 150 stations, and we are planning on installing 150 units this year. But there are certain requirements for the installation of EV stations. The location needs to be no more than 300 feet from the service point. This is for the voltage drop calculations and making it as close as possible to the service point. There should be no parking restrictions like a bike path in front of the location where the EV station is. The poles have to be adequate. Either they are steel poles or concrete poles, no ornamental poles. We will not be putting them on the EV stations on those. They are put in places where with lots of pedestrian traffic, like near coffee shops, condominiums, and they will not be put on traffic signal heads poles, because we do have some with traffic signal poles. So with that, I'll turn over the thing to Alejandro Huerta.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alejandro Huerta with Enterprise Community Partners, and I'm here to present on what makes a competitive AHSC or AHSC application. So first of all, I want to congratulate the city again and all the developers that participated in round 4, and obviously the success record was great. So congratulations. And I just want to say we wouldn't be here without the housing developers, obviously. So thanks for participating. It takes 2 to tango. So just really quickly, who is Enterprise? Enterprise Community Partners is a nationwide affordable housing nonprofit. And really our mission is to create more opportunities for low-income residents to have affordable houses. And why I'm here today is because I provide direct technical assistance to applicants throughout the state, in particular in Southern California, on the AHSC program. And in fact, this last round, I collaborated very closely with HCIDLA and the rest of the city departments on making all those applications win, in collaboration again with the housing developers and their individual consultants. So that's my role here. And I'll do a shameless plug here. I'm also the AHSC coordinator on behalf of the Strategic Growth Council in Southern California from here until around November. So I'm providing capacity building technical assistance for anyone who would want it. So I'm available to do that as well. So we're going to zoom out and think really big picture now. We've been getting into the weeds on things like street lighting and curb ramps. So let's ask ourselves, what makes a competitive application? And if you're considering applying to AHSC, what questions you should ask yourselves in order to assess whether or not, or how competitive rather you can be. So first of all, big caveat, there is no winning formula, unfortunately. AHSC is extremely complicated, as you've probably begun to assess by just hearing this presentation. It is a long, complicated process. That said, there are some things that you can do to begin to assess whether you're competitive or not. I just want to, before I move on to the actual details of what factors you'll need to consider in your housing development and in your AHSC application, I want to make some observations as AHSC has evolved through time. And in particular, from round 3 to round 4, what we saw across the state is that applications got more and more competitive. The program got more and more competitive. And so just anecdotally, what would have won in round 4 may not have won, sorry, let me take that back. What would have won in round 3 did not necessarily win in round 4 if you were to compare those two projects together side by side. And that is because of the greenhouse gas reductions. As you all remember, the intent of this program through the state laws is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So really, there's going to be a lot of things you can do that you can control, but there's a lot of things that a transit component and a transit agency will have to do in order to make your application the most competitive possible. So keep that in mind, that we are getting more and more competitive as the rounds proceed, and it's going to be even more important that your project and your application have a robust transit component. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. So there are several things that you may be able to control as a housing developer and others that you may not be. So these first two categories of factors are to some extent things that you can control. One of them is location. So as we were looking at the map earlier, if you are in a disadvantaged community or DAC, which thankfully, because like Claudia said, we're in LA, so that happens to be the majority of the area around here, you are in a DAC. So that gives you an advantage. And then these first two bullets are really, if you think about the intent of the program, right, it's to get people out of their cars and to bike and to walk and to take public transit. And so if you're located in an area where there's a lot of key destinations and amenities and it's walkable, you're already at a slight advantage there. So think about that. If maybe in the future rounds you're thinking about where to locate a housing development, location does actually matter significantly. So let's just say you've chosen the site already, and now you're actually looking at your housing development. And I want to just pause there for a second, because it is very important to mention that AHSC is meant for shovel-ready projects. So these are more questions that hopefully, if you have more time to think about, you can begin to influence. But even then, at this point in the process, you can actually tweak some things in your building design itself to help your score and your competitiveness. So if you think back to one of the earlier slides, the Weingart Tower that won in last round, what was the thing that stood out the most? It was huge and it was really dense. So if you're a building developer and you're working with your architect and you look at all your finances, you want to make sure that your housing development is large and has a lot of density, if possible. You also want to make sure that it's mixed use. Again, these are all things only if they're possible. And the reason for that, obviously, is that that's going to increase the likelihood that your residents are going to walk to the ground floor, perhaps, or neighbors will walk, and reducing people's VMT. If you're also going to limit parking, that's very important. Again, the intent is to get people out of their cars. And thankfully, here in the city of LA, we have the TOC program, which actually creates incentives to reduce parking. So really think about that as you think about your entitlements. And then lastly, this last item was added on to this last year's round of applications. If you can put solar PV panels on your roof and maximize that roof area with those solar panels, that's going to actually give you an advantage on the greenhouse gas front, and as well as another category in terms of your renewable building status, because your energy status, because of the fact that you're creating on-site energy production. So these are factors that you can influence as the housing developer. Other things that you can influence as the housing developer are related to your finances. And one of them is, as we've been talking about throughout this presentation, is AHSC wants the most bang for its buck. So if you can limit your AHSC ask as much as possible, that gives you an advantage, because then you have more leverage. And substantial leverage means more points. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it also influences your GHG score, because basically we want the most GHG reductions for the least amount of money through this AHSC program. Another component that you can influence in your housing development is if you include more than 20% of your total units as units dedicated to extremely low income residents. So now that I've talked about what you can influence, let's talk about the other things that Claire and the rest of the DOT team mentioned. And these are really critical, because you'll want to make sure that you're hitting all the minimum distance requirements in order to get max points. So we've already talked about this, But really quickly, in order to get max points, you want to make sure that you have at least 2 miles of context-sensitive bikeways and 3,000 feet of safe and accessible walkways. And most importantly, as I started off with this presentation with, is you're going to want to have a large GHG reduction score. And the way you're going to do that is through transit ridership increase. And I bolded the word increase because what AHSC is interested in is creating new opportunities for people to get out of their cars and to use public transit. In other words, just because you're located next to an existing bus stop or subway or light rail station does not in and of itself give you GHG reductions. You have to actually create new opportunities for people to get out of their cars. And you do that by buying buses, rail cars, subways, creating transit stations, transit hubs, and that you can demonstrate. Obviously, this will be in the purview of LADOT or Metro, whoever the transit agency is, to make sure that they can actually demonstrate that there's an increase in ridership. And only then can you claim GHG credits for that. And so that's really critical. And I would say that that's going to be more important as we proceed from here on with the rounds of AHSC applications in the city of LA. And the reason for that goes back to this slide that Coral showed earlier. This is 30 points of your application are dedicated to this GHG quantification. And that first bucket goes back to what I said earlier about your cost efficiency. So how many GHGs are you reducing per your AHSC ask? You want to make sure that you get that as efficiently done as possible. And then we're also looking at your raw GHG score. So that is, what is your total amount of metric tons reduced? So this is really critical. But let's not forget, and forgive me, this is an old slide, so some of this information is not accurate, so please refer to Coral's more updated slide. At the end of the day, you want to maximize your points as much as possible. And although it seems like you're really trying to scrape by sometimes, every single point matters. And so as you look at this table, you'll want to make sure that wherever possible, you are actually maxing out on each individual line of this chart in order to get the most points possible. Because trust me, when it comes time to actually deciding who is going to get awarded or not, it sometimes comes down to a single point or a couple of points. So keep that in mind. So what can you as a developer do right now? This is really high level. Obviously, you're here because you want to familiarize yourself with the program, so congratulations for already starting to do that. And also, you just want to make sure that your timeline matches the city's timeline and the AHSC program's timeline. So you want to make sure you have your land use approvals, your environmental clearances, and that you'll have your 90% enforceable funding commitment by February 2020. If not, then you should consider starting early for the next round. This third bullet is really important to the extent that you can, is you want to begin to do a self-evaluation of where you are. So what I would recommend is taking something like this table with all the scoring elements and literally walking through it line item by line item to see where you might fall. And then in order to judge your competitiveness, I would add to that, to the extent that you can do this, is do a preliminary greenhouse gas analysis, because that will give you a sense of how competitive your housing alone is on the greenhouse gas front. And if it's not, then how you actually need to begin to think big picture about what transit component can be added in order to make your application more competitive. And then last but certainly not least, and we've been talking about this a little bit in this presentation, is it's really critical that housing developers really begin to start engaging community members in and around their project site. And the reason for that is twofold, really. The intent of the AHSC program is to make sure that your application is going to reflect the needs of community residents and neighbors. And that's fundamental for your narrative. And then also, this is very important, if you can demonstrate in your application that you've engaged the community, and let's just say community members wanted more bus stops or bus lighting in a particular location, and you say, you know, we had 3 community meetings at which 30 people attended each meeting, and they all said that they wanted bus stops at this location, and then that in turn is fed to LADOT or the council office, That will go a long way in improving your application because it shows that you've taken, you've done the work. You've done the work to engage with the community and to inform your AHSC application. So with that, I will thank you, and I will be around at the end to answer more questions. And I will pass it on to Alina.
Hi, good morning. My name is Alina Tishenko, and I work for Housing, Community and Investment Department, City of Los Angeles Policy Unit. I will be going over round 5 co-application process. So we learned multiple lessons from round 4. The pipeline was better organized and potential projects were evaluated earlier in the process. STI and TRA scoping process has improved. There was clear coordination and roles among AHSC team members, developers, as well as city council members. Participation of DASH staff was critical in increasing GHG reduction outcomes. The narrative process has substantially improved, partially because of earlier review by all involved parties. Key participation and input from city council staff has been critical for STI and TRA component. And smoother joint application agreement process was a part of it. All hands on deck in-depth meetings were held, and there were 3 of those that were held during round 4 process. The City of LA round 5 project selection criteria is above, so project readiness and feasibility is extremely important, as well as ability to leverage city resources, for example, Prop HHA, Affordable Housing Trust Fund managed pipeline, and city-owned properties. Application scoring elements and criteria competitive is extremely important, as well as advanced HCIDLA prioritization planning efforts and policy objectives to produce and preserve affordable housing near transit. Advance and promote sustainable transit infrastructure and amenities that implement prioritized LADOT, LADTCP planning and policy objectives, including Vision Zero and Mobility Plan 2035. The city will determine the total number of applications, co-applications based on criteria, feasibility, as well as NOFA amounts. HCC round 5 call for projects. The call for project forms is currently open, and the deadline to submit the form August 18th, 2019. Even if you applied for Bob HHA, Short Managed Pipeline, please still register your project. Registration does not guarantee admittance into the city application process. You can find this form on HCIDLA lacity.org website and click on HCC Round 5 Call for Projects. If you have any questions regarding this form, you can contact me, Alina Tishenko, at the City of LA, and my contact information is on the developer form. Moving forward to round 5, the pre-selection process has started now, and project must meet all threshold criteria. The city project prioritization will be assessed for project selection, and the city will continue to select strong STI and TRA projects. GHG reduction outcomes is key in determining what project will be selected. The city council engagement and community-based organization engagement is critical in this process. As Alejandro mentioned, robust narratives and STI TRA development extremely important. All of these and much, much more make a successful application. As you can see, here's the timeline for City of LA round 5. So we will be evaluating submitted AHSC call for project forms this month. And in September, we'll be doing outreach to council offices, as well as reviewing potential projects against Strategic Growth Council threshold requirements. We'll finalize shortlist of potential round 5 projects and host developer clinics to learn more about those projects. And from about October until February, STI TRA scope and co-application development will continue. And of course, applications are due February 2020. For those of you who haven't signed an attendance form, please make sure you sign it. It's located right outside of this door to your right. And thank you for all of you who attended this meeting. Thank you for all the presenters who presented. And we'll start our question Q&As. If you have any questions. Yes, please.
So properties under this program have to be within the city of Los Angeles. What if they're unincorporated within the county of Los Angeles?
So the answer is a two-part response. Yes, they would have to be in the city of LA. However, we did collaborate with the county of Los Angeles for a property that they own in the city of Los Angeles. So that became a three-way joint application process. This is your time to ask questions. We have all of our staff and we have the Strategic Growth Council as well. Sure.
So really quickly, if you are in unincorporated LA County, I think we have a representative from the LA County CEO's office, or she was here at least, Bandit Dandelion. And if you do have a project that is in unincorporated LA County, you can let me know, because I'm working with LA County on their AHSC projects as well. So there you go.
For smaller scale developers building, let's say 6 to 15 unit buildings, is this worth applying for, or is it not really made for that?
Not in the city of Los Angeles. The GHG output, as we've been explaining, is substantially critical. If we don't get close to the 30 point, that application is really not competitive. So it will be very difficult, especially in an urban setting like LA. So your two options are TOD or an ICP. But even for an ICP, our average number of units for those projects was probably 65 to 75 units per project. So if you have a scattered sites, there could be other creative ways that we can look at it, but 15 units is just not going to make it.
Going off that question, are there other programs that the city of LA is working on for small developers?
If it will be very difficult to do that, even for our Measure HHH, and this is a creative type of program or project. If it's a homeownership development, although there's very few available resources for that, most of our homeownership program is really dedicated for first-time purchase assistance. If you're looking to develop one of our former redevelopment sites or any of the other city sites that we are currently or have RFP'd in the past, those may be some of those models, but it will be very difficult. Yes? Okay. Yeah.
So when you say that in August you will be expecting us to talk to you about the projects that you have, at this point, are you anticipating all the entitlements to be in place, or is it like we can concurrently work on entitlements and work with you so that we are ready for the 2020 application?
Yes, so if you are interested and you think your project is going to meet the February 2020 deadline, and it's more like January 2020, we're not going to be looking at anything beyond that, because we want to have assurances that, also working in that input from both our planning department and DOT, that we will have those entitlements. So you don't have to have everything ready, but you will have to let us know how you will intend to meet and basically pass the threshold criteria. So you don't have to have everything completed. So for instance, if your project falls in a TOC and you're pursuing that, that's something that is totally workable within this timeline. So we will be working, coordinating with you as well as with the team and the city council to then develop the STI TRA. If you have ideas and you've already looked and scoped at your project and you have input from the community based organizations or the public or the immediate stakeholders, bring that over. We will evaluate everything. And if you make the short list, we will be calling for the developer clinic. So this is another way that we actually sit down, the entire team and the city council staff member is present there along with enterprise to evaluate your project. And then after we complete that process, then we do another more in-depth review and then determine how many projects the city will be pursuing based on a number of factors. One of those were the top criteria that we outlined, and also capacity for the team to be able to do this. So last year we submitted 5 applications, but in prior iterations it's been 8. However, the program keeps getting more complicated and more, basically there are more elements. So we also have to look at the capacity for the city to be able to implement those projects, because now the city is taking on the grant component, and that does have a direct impact to the staff and in combination with all the other work that the city is engaging in. Yeah.
So basically, if we have a project that just starting on title, when we look at it and qualifies, then we would work with city planning to see if it fits in within the SB 35 or AB 2162 streamlining process, where we could complete entitlement before the deadline.
Correct. And so that's why the developer forum is critical. We ask you all those questions in there. So we urge you to submit that. It's a well thought out form because it's asking for all these different questions. And then we will assemble the team and address those questions directly. So the beauty about this, the way the program or the city approaches this program is that we are bringing all the key department staff that can really help navigate all of these questions in one shop. And it's been a great process, and we couldn't do this without the participation and their involvement and their determination. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, does the city have a sense of when award letters for HHH or no place like home will be out?
For which component? When did you apply for?
The last round. So I guess I'm just thinking about the 90% leverage, and there was a timeline that went over a little. So I was wondering when you would know.
So we coordinate with our own managed pipelines. If you're already in the managed pipeline, that's a win for you. If you have applied for HHH, we work with HHH staff to ensure that we get the approvals that are necessary that show that commitment. So we coordinate that internally. And then no place like home, I don't have an answer for you on that. Yes?
This is a question for SGC. Actually, there was a brief reference to looking at your total funding limits per project and trying to align with MHP, which normally MHP allows up to $20 million for the affordable housing itself. So are you guys considering increasing the AHD portion to $20 million and then increasing the non-available interest and security above that?
Yeah, so the plan is to make sure that there's still an incentive and available funding for the transportation component to increase the overall award amount. The exact number isn't quite set yet, but make sure that the $20 million is available for the loan and some additional amount of funding will be available for the transportation components that's still robust. So that's the plan. So although we do have more funding coming in, also likely larger award sizes.
And then so HCID is going to look at them there, because you guys had laid out 14 million to 6 million. So you guys would reassess.
Yes, I mean, that's just from the current guidelines. So we will definitely be updating that. So that really means that the STI and TRA will increase proportionally. So we are going to probably be looking at much more robust STI, TRA scopes. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Go ahead.
What should the timing be on the community outreach for the AHSC component of the transportation project?
So that should get started as soon as possible. For instance, the Weingart Towers project, when we were considering them for a co-application, had already started some of that community engagement process. So if you already done that either as part of your development, if you're doing any kind of outreach, community outreach right now as part of your development, do include questions that relate to pedestrian, safety, lighting, mobility issues. And then we will ask you, the developer is responsible for conducting the community outreach component, but we will provide support in the form of either attending some of those meetings. And we do have to have that in a much more focused, more intentional way. I mean, this is one of the things that made the narratives a lot more successful this time around, and also because of the rubric that was introduced by the SGC as part of the round 4 guidelines. So I would suggest looking at that very carefully so that you already have a roadmap of how to do that. And then we will combine that along with other efforts that the city has engaged in, with the community in terms of the mobility plan or any of the number of plans that were outlined by DOT, BOE, and the planning department.
Yes, I have a question about the developers, and you had mentioned something about the prevailing wages. And I just wanted to know, is there the developers rate, does that have something to do with Section 3 or HUD? Or do they have to pay prevailing wages, or what was that about?
If you're receiving federal funds, yes. And you want to answer that? Yeah.
So it's also true
Yeah.
of state funds that
Yeah.
if you're using money from HCD or SGC, that you have to pay for it.
Right. Kim?
Do you have like a set target of how many applications you want to work on, like, based on capacity?
I'm not going to commit us to a number. I'm looking at my team. That's something that we're going to be determining. We will invite as many potential co-applicants to our developer clinics, those that meet that initial review, and then we will make that determination. But we will definitely know by September. Mm-hmm.
I'd love clarity on the selection process and all that. I was just thinking if there's only going to be a few projects that you select, and if you're prioritizing city invested projects, and if I'm a developer that I'm not on a city piece of land, or if I'm not in the pipeline, then I would want to know now if I don't even have a chance.
Right. But that's not true. I mean, we had a project, Manchester Urban Homes, located in South LA, and it was one of the featured projects in the SGC presentation, and that had zero funding, and it's not a city-owned site. So it's an independent project, but we became co-applicants. So there was no public funding from the city in that. So it's not impossible. Yes.
I just have one more question. I was involved in the community with the Watts project over in New Orleans, and I want to know, you said that there was some companies or organizations that was in the loop still from round 4. And is there a list of those people there that's in that loop right there? And what are the possibilities of, getting into this round 5?
You mean a prior application that was?
Applicants, yeah. I think you guys said something like that there. There were some prior applicants from round 4 that you guys had lined up, and since the limited amount of applicants, I guess you guys had 5 in round 4. And so, is there a list, or is there something that we can see on that?
Let me see. We usually don't make the entire list of developers or projects available. Whatever is available is what we're working on. However, if you like to have a separate conversation, we're happy to do that. And if you're not ready for round 5, we encourage you to look at round 6. And this program is going to be around for a very long time. And one of the things that we're diligently working on is to have an available kind of pipeline of projects on the transportation side of things, as well as our housing development. So one of the things that we really want to work towards is combining those two so that developers know what the city's intentions are, or where we're going to be prioritizing funding for affordable housing and also for transportation related programs, because those two go hand in hand, and it is a priority of the mayor and also of the city council. So we take that very, very seriously. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your being here. And please submit your developer form. And it's due in 2 weeks. And then you'll be hearing from us. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. We have all of our emails and information available to you. Oh, we will be sending the slides to everybody that registered, and this session was also recorded, so you can refer to it. Thank you.